Hi, how's everyone doing today? I am Angelique Bochnak, and I will be moderating this session on genres, common themes, common restrictions. And I have a couple other authors with me here today, and we're going to talk about diversity and how we as authors focus on diversity in the genres in which we write, and how we as authors can maybe improve or change some of the common trends that we see in fiction writing today. So we're going to start with just kind of introducing who we are. As I mentioned, my name is Angelique. I write under two different pen names. I write science fiction and fantasy under the pen name A.M. Bochnak, and romance under the name Aria Bliss. And my writing really focuses on portraying women as strong leaders in various roles, whether they be, the good guys or the bad guys, and how women can take more ownership of who we are as individuals in our stories. And so that's been my primary focus on my writing. And so I'd like to hand it off to one of my other panelists here. Elle, would you like to go first and introduce the viewers to yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Elle, and like our host, I also write very strong female characters, lead characters, and villains. I write science fiction, lesbian, and bisexual romance novels for DSP publications. I have 4 out right now, and I just signed a contract for 3 urban fantasy lesbian romances and another science fiction lesbian romance as well. So a lot going on in the next couple of years. You can find me at DSP Publications.
Should I go next? All right, so I'm Jose Iriarte. I am primarily known for my short fiction. I have short stories. I write science fiction and fantasy and young adult. I have short stories in a variety of professional magazines, including Lightspeed Magazine, Strange Horizons, Fireside Fiction, Forthcoming, and Uncanny Magazine. My longer work is represented by Cameron McClure at Donald Moss Literary Agency. I've been a finalist for the Nebula Award. I've been longlisted for the Tiptree Award, which is now known as the Otherwise Award. And my stories tend to center either non-binary people or women or Latinx characters who share my ethnic background. And they generally are known for being kind of strong on the feels. That's kind of my brand.
Right. And I'm Shamim Sarif. I am a novelist, also write screenplays and direct for film and television. But in whatever form of storytelling I do, it's always been about having women front and center, and often women of color, and often LGBTQ women, which has not been a picnic in the film industry for the past 15 years. It's getting better for sure. And in book-wise, my most recent novel series is The Athena Protocol and The Shadow Mission. And that's out with HarperCollins just in the last year. And that focuses on a team of women who run a rogue agency with the aim of helping other women who are in trouble, whether they're being trafficked or not being given education, the kind of people that fall through the cracks for governments everywhere. So they're a secret agency run by 6 very diverse women.
All right, great. It's kind of a nice diversity of representation here, which is great. Since we all write, somewhat different stories, but that overlap in maybe some of our overarching themes of the topics that we address. As I like to think about, think about fiction, and I see this as something that has kind of been shifting a lot in the last year when we think about how we accurately represent our society. So do we portray, when we write, are we telling stories that accurately represent either the historical journeys that our society has taken in our societal interactions, versus focusing on writing fiction that portrays society interactions the way they should be, the way we should be viewing each other, and the diversity that we as a society represents. And I'd be very curious to hear how you guys, when you're writing your stories, how you tend to, since you guys write science fiction as well, how you focus your writing. Do you focus on what history has been and what it has taught us, or what maybe it should have been?
Who do you want to go first?
Want me to go
Um,
first? Whoever wants to go first. I mean, I'm just,
I'll go first.
yeah.
So in my trilogy that's out now in my universe, it's Earth-based, but it's far enough into the future that there's not. I mean, the majority of mankind still lives on Earth, but there's been a lot of planetary colonization. There's a lot of interstellar travel, and so you don't have too much set on Earth. There are vague references to things like, why are you worried about the two of us being seen together? No one's worried about that since 2035. That kind of thing. So that it acknowledges, but it depicts a world in which LGBTQ pairings and representation is the norm and completely accepted and expected to be in that society. And so you don't have those conflicts in, except maybe on the outer rim worlds who haven't quite advanced as much. It's not at the forefront of my worlds. In the upcoming series, which is urban fantasy, which is set in modern day, the characters, it's background, but the characters do struggle with some discrimination because of the fact that they are a female-female couple. But in my current series, you don't see it much. It acknowledges the existence of what happened, but you don't see it in that present time.
I'll jump in. Most of my stories are actually set in a contemporary setting. I am most drawn to contemporary fantasy and to the idea that there is magic in the world if you just know to look for it. Occasionally I try to branch outside of that, but that's where I tend to be. So I will generally tend to reflect the world that I see, but I think that we do have a choice to make between when we write about marginalization, does that necessarily mean also centering oppression or choosing not to? And I don't think either choice is wrong. Certainly, sometimes as a reader, I crave stories about confronting oppression and overcoming it. But sometimes I also just want stories about, where that's not what it's about. So in the story that I'm best known for, Substance of My Lives, the protagonist is non-binary, and actually the protagonist is genderqueer, and there are people who are not okay with that, but they're not the main characters in the story. So it's just a background that is acknowledged, but the story isn't about that, and it isn't a story about oppression. The protagonist's mother, they live with a single mother, and their single mother loves them, and they have a best friend who loves them also, and they're not struggling to accept themselves or to find acceptance from the people who are closest to them. They've already got that, and they're just living their life and fighting their other battles.
Yeah. So yeah, I've done both, and I think they're both very valid because as Jose mentioned, I think that there are elements where you want to see people rising up and doing something, and my very first book, The World Unseen, was set in South Africa, in apartheid South Africa. That was sort of inspired by stories that I knew about my parents and my grandparents who grew up there. And I was very militantly like, oh my God, it's so appalling. And so, it was just drove me nuts. But what I did in that novel was kind of reconceive my grandmother's story rather than just tell it and say, okay, because I was trying to think, what would it have taken for her to think in a patriarchal Indian Muslim society where above that there was the government telling you that you were lesser than? What would it take to actually question all of that? Who would you have to meet, and how would you, So that was the kind of the story I told. So in a way, it was kind of a total reimagining of it. Maybe it shouldn't have been that way, but that was how I wish it could have been, And it's. I think there's some power and excitement in seeing an oppressive world that we understand and we know to be true, and seeing characters who go for it. So but having said that, with the Athena Protocol, again, they're fighting for oppressed women, but they're a team of women who are very diverse. The lead character Jessie in the Athena Protocol is the voice for the story. It's told through her eyes, and she's queer, and it's not an issue for anybody. So it was also nice for me to write something, especially in the action adventure genre, that that had a a lead woman who was queer where that wasn't an issue, because that's not often the case in that genre. So I just felt it would be nice to just tell the story and just say, this is the world as it exists. There are women of color, there are LGBTQ people, and it doesn't matter. People are okay with it.
It sounds like something I'm going to have to check out very soon. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I may have, like, with my first series, the Magical Bond series, like I wanted to, like, so in that, like I created a world in a universe, and so it is somewhat of a contemporary setting. It's a little bit set in the future, but based on Earth, but in a world where magic was always real, and magic was what ruled, and magic meant power, and magic meant, leadership and positions of power. And I tried to take gender out of it completely, and that it didn't matter who the person was that was in power, even though I put women in those positions of power, but their position of power was never questioned because they were women. It was just, this was how things were, right? Because magic drove the power and the leadership, not gender. And then creating an oppressed group of people who were the non-magical people, the people who were born and evolved to not have magic, and kind of used and our current day struggles with oppression and oppression towards specific groups as kind of the example that drove how the story developed. So that, but my primary goal, and I wanted to put women in position of power where they were not questioned because they were women in that position of power. It was normal. It was what was, it was just part of what was expected in that society, that people with the most power, magic, were the people who ruled and led, and then either led the fight against the oppression or were the oppressors. So again, making it something that was very normal and never questioned why a woman would be in these positions. So yeah, it's and I personally like to see more stories. I agree, you want to see, sometimes seeing the oppression and seeing the issues that we really struggle with is important, and those are important stories to tell. But also, I like seeing where it's like, this is just the norm and there is no reason to question why these things are happening.
Yeah, I agree, because I think we use stories a lot, as ways to think about our lives, right? And to think, characters going through a struggle, even if it's not the exact same thing, it gives you an idea about how you would react, or how would I react under that pressure. It's like human navigation, basically. So I think it's great, and I've certainly had feedback for films and books where people are like, oh, it made it feel possible, and I think there's a huge value in that, which is, I think, what you're saying, is creating a world where it's normal. It has a tremendous value in just building that possibility in people's minds.
Yeah, for sure. I remember when I first started writing stories, I kind of defaulted to writing protagonists who were not like me, because
I've done the exact opposite.
I had internalized the definition of what a protagonist was, So, an Anglo blonde guy, I guess. So, to what you say, sometimes it's just good to see ourselves in the stories at all.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that. I mean, it leads kind of into some of the next topic, is like, that's where I think my biggest struggle is in writing, is writing beyond what my comfort zone, what I know, and like, so I know me, and so a lot of times my protagonists, they share characteristics similar to my own characteristics because that's what I know really, really well. And I struggle with this, I think, more on the romance side than I do on the science fiction side, as I try to really push the boundary of taking stories away from the all-white heterosexual cast and diversifying that, and being comfortable with diversifying that with things that maybe are outside of my own comfort zone, that I don't know as well as how I know myself. And so how do you guys kind of overcome, I guess, that internal struggle we may, or maybe you guys don't have that internal struggle with yourselves like I do, so that your fiction accurately and respectfully depicts these minority diverse groups?
I think something that's worth thinking about is that we all have multiple identities, and identities along multiple axes. So I can write a character who is like me in a lot of ways and then just isn't like me in some other way. And as long as, I think where I would feel like I was on shaky ground would be if I was trying to tell the story of a struggle that I had not experienced. But if I have a character who shares a lot of identity aspects with me, and is marginalized in a way that I'm not, but I'm not really telling the story of marginalization or of the struggle. It may be present in the background. Then I feel like the places where I can draw on my experience leave me on safer footing.
Yeah. For me, that's key as well. Although, you know, I haven't been a spy or whatever, but or I'm not telling. But yeah, but I think that's I think that's it, right? Isn't that what we all do at the end of the day? I mean, there's no, we couldn't possibly, I'm sure, you know, looking at 2035 or wherever it is, the science fiction of it all, there's no way we've all experienced that, but we take elements of what's familiar to us. So you know, I think that's legitimate. I think it's a very tricky question right now, is that, you know, are you appropriating somebody else's culture by having a, you know, a black character when you're not black or what have you? But it, you know, I just think, I think it's always dangerous to have to pigeonhole or pen writers into that, or to say, you know, that because I'm of Indian ethnic origin, but it's the classic. People go, oh, you know, I've got a great script for you. It's Indian people. I know, okay, I'm 3 generations back, but people will go, well, she can do it. So, you know, it's kind of that. What is, you know, your experience is everything. And so I think it's just, you know, it's careful. You have to be careful not to have that pendulum swing so far that way that you're restricting writers and their imaginations and what they can bring to the table.
Yeah, it's interesting because I end up on a lot of diversity panels because of what I write. And it's always funny that, you know, if I'm not very out and open, so I am bisexual. And so if I don't actually say that in the course of the panel somewhere, I will have people come up to me afterwards and acute, well, and I'm also married to this guy. So, you know, I get a lot of questions on, well, how is it okay for you to write lesbian and bisexual characters? You're not lesbian or bisexual. You're married to this man here. And, you know, it's like, bisexual means that I could be married to a guy and it's still being bisexual. But I'm also, you know, I'm very careful that if I'm depicting women living a lesbian lifestyle, that I run it by women who are living a lesbian lifestyle and make sure that I'm not saying anything that would be offensive or inappropriate. And but yeah, it's a really funny conversation to have, especially at live conferences where I've had people actually walk up to me and say, well, how come it's okay for you to write this, but you are saying that you need to have everybody check this other thing? Yeah, it's fun.
I think about this from a couple of different perspectives. As a writer, I don't want to feel like I can only write characters who are not just cisgender, or like I can only write, you know, characters who are very narrowly focused on my identities. And so therefore, I don't want to hold anybody else to that also. But then as a reader, I would love to see more characters like me, but authors like me, like us, are in a minority. And so there's that weird, like, if only somebody, if you know, who's going to write the Cuban American characters? Well, does that mean that only I better write Cuban American characters? That I better only write Cuban American characters? I want them to exist. I want them to be out there. And so that means I want some people who are not Cuban American to also remember that we exist, and also throw characters like me in there. But I think, you know, there are some stories that if you haven't grown up the way that I've grown up, there are some stories that you can tell and extrapolate, and there's some stories that you can't.
Yeah, I think that you make a very good point there, and I agree with that completely. In that, as authors, regardless of our background and where we come from, I think I agree. It's important to remember that like they said, you want to see yourself in other people's stories, not just your own. And you know, it's a challenge. It is. I mean, for sure. But I think, and I think what Elle said is, you know, when you feel called to do that, I think it's also very important to bring in, you know, your friends and others who do live that lifestyle, who do know those struggles and experiences to make sure your writing is being respectful and truly representing, you know, those diverse groups of individuals. Yeah, I think that's, I personally think that's very important as well. And I like seeing that diversity in the books that I read, because I don't want to just see myself all the time. I want to see other people's struggles and other diverse groups and what they're doing and what they're dealing with in the books that I read as well.
And I also,
Yeah.
you know, as authors, the responsibility is, I mean, okay, I'm not saying, I am saying that the more groups we put into our books, the more normalizing it becomes. And the more people see this as the norm, the less oppression I hope we will see as a world. You know, the more that it's common and out, and this is narrow and obvious. This is the way the world is, not thinking of it in this space. Hopefully people's minds become less narrow as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, so then I guess thinking on that, and then as we think about ourselves as writers and some of the different, we think about maybe even character wounds, as we think about wanting to like make this all normalized. I guess when we're depicting some of these wounds in our characters, you know, when does heavy become too heavy, and when does taking some of these wounds of different diverse groups become too far, but yet still being all inclusive?
What do you mean by wounds?
Well, like dealing with, like, so different diverse
Yeah.
groups have dealt with different levels of oppression and discrimination that, you know,
How much?
white people, yeah. So it's like when we think about those wounds and how these different diverse groups may respond to these or be dealing with these struggles, it may be very different than, say, the struggles I've had for myself. And so as we start thinking about how we represent these in our writing, you know, how deep do we go? How deep is there a level that takes something too far without it still remaining that respectful, that respectfulness to those minority groups?
I don't know if you can take anything too far. You know, anything is fair game. You know, to be put into art, I think, and be explored. It needs to be explored. You know, there's been some horrific stories from, for example, from the Bosnian Serbian War and all of those kinds of things. Horrific. But the bigger question is, am I the person to tell that story? That would be really, really hard to do. And I think that is where, you know, you start to fall down. It's one thing to have a secret agent who's a Chinese background. I know enough about that culture. I have the friends, I have the thing, or an Arab agent because I'm married to a Palestinian. It's something that I've very much become part of. But if I was going to take on that subject, for example, genocide in Rwanda or whatever, I feel like, you know, in order to give it that respect, it would have to be something that really you've internalized and understood on some very deep level. So, you know, but having said that, if genocide is the key, and I'm making this up, but
That's okay. We write fiction. That's what we do.
about genocide, no, they're not. But if I was going to do it, then I would be like, you know, maybe that's the point where you go to a completely fictional world, where you can explore things in a world that you've created of your own, where you can really know it well. Because I think, in a way, we say how deep is too deep. It needs to be so deep that it feels authentic, and I think that's where, you know, only as a, you know, you want to make that decision as a writer, not to have critics and other people tell you you shouldn't be doing that because you're this color or you're that gender. But what you want to do, I think, is for us as writers to take the responsibility of giving that respect to these difficult subjects.
I really like the way that you put that, because I hear a lot of people talk in terms of, you know, am I allowed to write about this, and am I allowed to write about that? But I really like the way that you kind of shifted that locus of control there. Yeah, I don't have an experience of the multi-generational effects of slavery. So I'm probably not, if I were to attempt glibly to write in that vein, I would probably, my lack of awareness of little things would show. I may have done whatever reading and I may have done whatever listening, but I can't have that depth of knowledge. So, I think a lot in terms of insider stories and outsider stories, so that doesn't mean I can't write a Black character or a Black protagonist, but it means that's a story that I'm not the person who's going to do a good job if I want to confront that head on. So I sometimes say, for instance, me, while I am Latinx, I pass for white in this country and my English is good and I am educated. And if you wanted to write a protagonist like me, and you're not of my background, you could probably do a pretty solid job. There are some stories that are not for somebody who's not me to tell, but if you just were writing about, a spy character who happened to come from my background just doing cool shit and he's a spy and that's it, then you could do that,
I will tend to tell things in a more of a metaphorical way than to attempt them head on. Like my character is part machine. And so a lot of her human rights have been taken away. She's considered property, is my main character. And we find out very quickly that she is very, very human, but the world doesn't see her that way. And so she has to fight for her human rights on a daily basis. And so if and a lot of people have said, oh, that's an extended metaphor for LGBTQ rights. And I'm like, well, you take from it what you want and need to take from it. I've had another friend who is a wheelchair user say, oh, that's a metaphor for body autonomy and having things in place so that you can function in society. Like, well, you take from it what helps you and go from there. But I'm not going to try to tell those stories not coming from that background. But if that's what you see in that character and it helps you, well, then great. I'm glad that you found something in that character that you could connect to.
Yeah, I think that's such a great way to do it, because really what you're then speaking to is like the universal elements that are important for people that for the issues that they're dealing with, that they can all read that into your story, right? So that your work becomes like a dialogue between you and the reader in a way.
I hope so.
Yeah, I think that's, for me, that's one of the reasons why I particularly love writing like science fiction and fantasy, because it does provide that opportunity to draw upon the emotions that we can imagine go behind these, even like we've all dealt with our own type of oppression in some way, right? And we know what those emotions are and those feelings that have affected us under our conditions and our circumstances, and then being able to use those emotions to create something totally new, a fantastical world that it doesn't exist, that is ours, and then driving those and using those emotions to drive those stories and those characters forward without having to touch upon, certain, issues with, that I'm not necessarily qualified to write, right? But can create these worlds where those same emotions drive the characters and the stories forward. And I think that's kind of like, like using our everyday horrors and crimes, the things that we know happen to people, to put meaningful representation on the page in our own way. So let's see, what else we can talk about today. So I know, so we've got, traditionally published, right? As well as, both of you, and indie published, independently published, self-publishing was, that's my world. Okay, so I guess that's an interesting question then that maybe think about, is the difference between how female diversity representation in genre fiction, between the different genre between traditionally published world versus like as an indie author, there's a lot less restrictions, right? I can write the stories I want to tell and publish them, and so the struggles and challenges, I guess the difference between that in a traditional publishing platform versus an indie publishing platform. I'd like to hear your perspectives on that.
It's been an interesting road. You know, if you follow me on Facebook at all, you know that I've had 4 agents. I'm on my 4th, and she's doing a fantastic job for me. I'm very pleased with where I am now. But you know, we would always shoot my work at the big 5, or I guess now it's the big 4, and I would get feedback. The most heart-crushing one was from Tor, which was, this was so close. If we still had a mid list, we would have bought this. Yeah, that just about destroyed me, and ended up in a small traditional press, but it was kind of, it was just like lightning striking, because diversity is getting better out there. And so the press I'm with was traditionally all male romance, and they want to diversify from there. And so they opened in another imprint. And so I am their first writer of genre, female, that's the romance is secondary. And I'm the only one writing female in the house, and also the only one doing science fiction romance, as opposed to romance first and another genre second. So it's definitely opening up, but it's not as open as I would love to see it be.
I have a perception that, you know, people are free to disagree with, but I perceive that the traditional short fiction market, at least in genre fiction, which is where I am, is much more open to diversity than the novel market. And I think it's because they don't need to look at the number of units moved, and so they don't have to analyze the marketplace in terms of will white readers buy this book? Well, who cares? We're going to put it out there, and you know, and they can buy it or not, and it doesn't matter, because that's not the way the financial structure is. You know, so I mean, there are certainly different markets, different magazines that have a different target demographic, but I have found it just in general a much more welcoming scene. On the other hand, it seems to me that agents would very much like there to be a lot of diversity, but they don't necessarily always have the success of selling that to the publishers, because when it comes time to go to the board, and when it comes time for the bean counters to do their profit and loss statements and all that stuff, you know, because I do have a middle grade book deal that is not yet in a place where I'm supposed to talk about it. But I have found, and it's an IP deal, it's not my original property. I have found when trying to place my original property out there that, there is kind of a wall that I'm not experiencing in short fiction. And there's a lot of people saying, we want this, but at the end of the day, we want this, kind of falls short somewhere.
Yeah, and it's been interesting working from the small press up, because we started with a trade paperback that, you know, was available through all the bookstores online, but not in physical bookstores, and earned out and sold well enough that they decided, okay, now we're going to try a small mass market paperback run and put a few out there in physical bookstores. So that just happened, and I know that there's a small print run out there in actual brick and mortar stores. So I'm kind of going at it in the reverse. You know, I'm kind of pushing that ceiling a little higher. You know, it's taking a long time, but the numbers have been there enough that we're seeing that it can go a little bit further.
I want to throw another thought in there, not tagging on to what you were saying, but just revisiting something that was going through my head also. I think that often when traditional publishing finally does say, and I'm thinking really here, Big Five, when they finally say, yes, we want X, they want X for the non-marginalized view, you know, for the non-marginalized gaze. Okay. So we want the next story of crossing the border, and we don't care who writes it. We want,
not that we're referring to any particular title or anything.
we want the queer story of a tragic death. And I'm not saying, you know, back to your earlier question about wounds, I am all for the right authors probing those wounds, but that's all they want, is they want that one story. And so if you've got, well, first of all, if they already bought that one book, then it's a while before they feel the need to, well, we already have our Latinx book, we already have our transgender book, we don't need another one. And also, they're not so interested in a transgender book about, you know, whatever, a spy. They want a transgender book about coming out of the closet. That's what they want, you know.
Right, and heaven forbid that that one book doesn't do well, because then it's going to be a very long time before they're going to take a chance on another one.
I mean, I've had that exact experience, but more in the film industry. So maybe that makes my, you know, my experience with HarperCollins, who I'd not published before with, was very good. And
That's awesome, by the way. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. And having come from film, especially, you know, pre the last couple of years, pre Me Too, Weinstein, the fact that Netflix realized that we could actually have other stuff, where the whole theatrical distribution is completely controlled by, you know, middle-aged white guys who are just like, you know, that very much was like, oh no, we've got our female film, we've got our this, you know, with Despite the Falling Snow, was kind of it was published with Potter Headline here, and the film, but again, it's a lead female role. It was Rebecca Ferguson from Mission Impossible, you know, not a sort of slouch of an actress, but and the theatrical distributor in America said, well, we would have given you 2,000 screens if this was, say, a Colin Firth story and it was a guy in of it. You know, going back what, 5 years? Yeah, so it's just, so by the time, you know, I've been through that, making 3 or 4 films now over the last 10 years. By the time I got this deal with HarperCollins, I'm like, well, you know, I don't know. My agent was like, what don't you know about? You know, I mean, it's like, it's a 2-book deal, sign there. And I'm like, but what do they want to change? And she's like, nothing. And I'm like, what, really? And it was, okay, they had edits, but they were actually making the book better, even though I knew it was a work of genius when I handed it over. You know, if you've got a good editor, they're always going to show you something better. But there was nothing to do with that. But so I was like, wow, great. You know, it was such a relief to be able to just express yourself. And I think there's, maybe because I crossed between the 2 worlds, there's certainly a lot more respect and for the author in the book world than there has been traditionally in film. So it was kind of almost a happy relief for me. But then I was like, okay, now we start making the TV show or pitching the TV show. Are they going to? Because all I've heard all my life is, can you make one of them a man? Can you make one of them white? Can you make? And so I was like, okay, 6 women, they're all, you know, pretty diverse. I'm like, now what? And so far, it's been like a plus. It's like, you know, tears in my eyes. I'm like, really?
Yeah, that's the. So we've got about 5 minutes left here, and I think that this is very interesting. Both of you said very interesting things, and so it's like, so there's, I mean, I get a sense that maybe there's a little bit of hope. We're starting to change that mindset, but how far are we away from actually getting to where the scenario that Jose brought up is not the norm? That we are not seeing like, well, we got our one book and we don't care who wrote that, but we've got multiple books, and the authors that are writing these books they represent the minority in which the topic is about. Like, how do we get to that point, and how far are we away from being to that point where that is the norm, and that is what we're seeing in the publication industry?
I think I'll just say one thing. We need to be super, super vigilant and always keep pushing, because I had a good experience that time. If Brexit and Donald Trump has taught me nothing else, it has taught me that you cannot take your liberties and your democracy and all of these things for granted, right? That we didn't think we had to fight for 20 years ago. And now suddenly we're like, it's like a battle for the soul of the world. So can you tell I'm a drama queen? So,
yeah, but it's right. It's true.
We have to stop from the top. We have to start from the top down too. You know, the publishing houses need to be having a lot more diversity on their boards and in their acquisition editors positions, and it's getting better. It absolutely is. But I think until we see the people buying the books becoming more diverse, we are going to continue to struggle to get them to want more diverse books.
I think that's a really important point because
I know, I stole it from
because you'll have people say, well, I'm colorblind, I'm gender blind, I'm just going to buy the best stories. Well, but the best stories, as they pass through your filter, which may not be equipped to recognize things that ring true to other people with different experiences.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's like, the people at the top are the ones making the decisions, and so how do we change the top? How do we get to that point, and what is it going to take to get to that point? And I think that's true for any industry, right? But I think as writers, we're in a unique position to be able to tell stories that can change people's lives, and how we do that and how we get those stories out there is really, really important and really important. So yeah, so we've only got a couple minutes, but I see Raquel popping back on here. So our time is about. Is there anything else that you guys would like to add before we kind of bring this session to a close? I think the insight from all of you has been wonderful, and I've really enjoyed listening to you guys talk about this topic. So yeah, so thank you so much for being here.
I think there was a question in the box. You
Okay.
guys sort of touched on it, I believe, but if anybody has any other additional thoughts, if Anne, you want to read it?
Yep, give me one sec. Let me just expand this really quickly. The question is, what are your thoughts on writing in the point of view of an ethnicity and or gender or sexual orientation that's not your own, especially if it's a marginalized group? How can we portray diversity in an authentically respectful way when we aren't a part of that community?
And so for me, that just keeps coming back to inside stories and outside stories. A lot of people throw out that the character of Ripley in Alien was originally written to be a male character, and then Sigourney Weaver ended up getting the role. And for me, it works.
Yeah, it worked well. I can't imagine a man in that role.
Right? But they weren't trying to tell the inside story of what it is like to be a woman dealing with oppression. There may have been misogyny in her crew. I don't remember the movie that well, but that wasn't the story,
Yeah, I think it depends on what story you're trying to tell. If you want to have a diverse cast doing all the things and living their lives in a world where oppression is not necessarily a major issue, that's one thing. If you're trying to tell what it's like to be a Black person in an oppressive world, if that's the story you're telling, then that might not be your story.
Great.
Sorry. No, I think it's touched on it early on as well. It's just that, I think it's a responsibility not just for publishers and critics to decide what you tell, but for yourself to figure out. Because, you can't always tell. I was saying, because I have Indian ethnicity, people assume I know everything about India, but I'm actually a couple of generations removed. So, and that works both ways. So, I think it's down to writers also to take a little bit of that responsibility on them to say, is this a story that I feel qualified to tell? I don't think a writer should be unnecessarily restricted to just writing about people that look like themselves or have only had that experience. But you want to be authentic, you want to be real, you want to be respectful. So I wouldn't go writing about certain stories that I couldn't do justice to. And I think it's something that we can all take on board, basically.
Right, and regardless of the story, absolutely get eyes on it from those groups that you're representing, whether that you're talking about the discrimination or the marginalization or not. You still want to run it by people who can check it and make sure that you're not saying anything inappropriate.
I've even done this for works when I am actually writing about groups that I belong to, because there is, such a thing as internalized prejudice. And so you may not be aware of something that you've internalized.
Oh, I've run into that a lot with trying to represent different female-male interactions of power, and just like saying things that, because you're right, absolutely right. We internalize things in our own way as well, that the larger population might not view it the same way. And so it's important to get that input on even our own issues that we deal with and struggle with, for sure.
Thank you guys so much for being here. It was great.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you for having us. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, this was great.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm totally looking for those books for both of you.
Great, thank you.